winter of 1882 came hard to Mill Creek, Kansas, the kind of cold that found every gap in your walls and stayed there like an unwelcome creditor. The town sat low in the valley, its main street a single strip of clapboard and mud, its people the kind who worked too hard to mind much of anyone else's business, except when the business was made public enough to ignore. Now, Clara Bennett was not a woman who asked for spectators, but on a Thursday morning in December, Edwin Pike made sure she had them. He stood in the middle of Main Street with a paper from the land office folded in his coat and a voice pitched loud enough to carry past the feed store, past the smithy, past the post, and straight into every ear that had come to town for supplies that week. He was the brother of Clara's late husband, Matthew, gone 14 months now, taken by a winter fever that gave no warning and showed no mercy. And Edwin had decided, in the manner of men who mistake volume for authority, that it was time to settle things. He said a woman alone could not hold a homestead. He said the land ought to pass back to a man who carried the Bennett name. He said if Clara had sense, she would accept his help and leave, with her dignity still wearing its Sunday clothes. Clara stood between her children with a list of dry goods in her coat pocket and both boots flat in the frozen mud. She was 29 years old. She had buried her husband, kept her cattle through a hard season, repaired the north fence line herself, and filed every paper the land office required. She did not flinch. She did not cry. She looked at Edwin Pike the way a woman looks at weather. Not afraid of it, only accounting for it. "That land belongs to me and my children," she said. "I will not leave it." Edwin folded his paper back into his coat, smiled the way a man smiles when he believes time is on his side, and rode away. The street returned to its business, not fast, not slow. The way a crowd disperses when it has witnessed something uncomfortable and is not sure whether to be ashamed of its own silence. On the far side of the road, a man named Samuel Reed had watched every moment of it. He was 34. Lean from work rather than hardship, with a water hauler's patience and a habit of speaking only when he had something worth saying. He drove the water routes for the homesteads outside Mill Creek, knew the roads, knew the land, knew the families who worked it. He had known Matthew Bennett the way men know each other in frontier country, through borrowed tools, shared labor, a nod across a fence line. He had respected Matthew. He respected the claim Matthew had left behind. He did not step into the street while Edwin was speaking. That was Clara's fight, and she had handled it the only way it could be handled, with her own voice, standing her own ground. But when the bough of flour slipped from her hands as she loaded the wagon, Samuel was across the road before it hit the boards. He lifted it, set it in the wagon bed, touched the brim of his hat once, and stepped back. He did not say anything. He did not need to. That was the story of Clara Bennett and Samuel Reed in its first breath. Not love, not longing, but one person steadying a load for another without making it mean more than it was. Before that winter was done, the whole town of Mill Creek would have to reckon with what it had watched and said nothing about. And what began as a paper arrangement between two people who needed different things from each other would become something neither of them had planned on. This is their story, a tale of a woman the world tried to make small, and the man who proved the difference between holding a deed and building a home. Clara had been running the homestead alone for 14 months before Edwin showed his hand, and she had learned the particular arithmetic of survival in that time. She knew what a barrel of salt cost and how long it stretched. She knew the north fence needed new posts before spring. She knew the well ran 4 feet shallower in August than in March, and she had adjusted her planting accordingly. What she did not know how to account for was what the law believed. The Homestead Act required proof of residence, proof of cultivation, proof of improvement. Clara had all three, documented in the same careful handwriting she used to teach Noah his letters. But the land office answered to men, and men answered to other men, and Edwin Pike had friends in county offices who understood that a widow's paperwork was only as strong as the family name attached to it. She had understood this before Edwin stood in the street. She had understood it the morning after Matthew's burial, when she sat at the kitchen table and went through every document in the tin box under the bed, sorting what she had from what she still needed. Her hands had been steady. Her eyes had been dry. There was no time for grief that was not also useful. It had not always been this way for her, that tightening of the chest, that learned refusal to ask for anything she might not receive. Back in Missouri, where she'd grown up, her father had signed away the family's small farm to settle a debt when Clara was 11, and the family had moved 3 times in 4 years after that. She had watched her mother pack and unpack the same 6 boxes, each time saying it would be fine, each time believing it a little less. Clara had made herself a quiet promise, standing in the yard of the last rented house. She would never hold something on borrowed ground again. Matthew had understood this about her. He had not needed her to explain it. When they filed for the homestead together, he had told the land office agent that the claim was in both their names, and when the agent had frowned and looked at Matthew and said, "Most men file alone," Matthew had said, "Most men didn't marry Clara." She had loved him for that. She still did, in the way you love something that is past. Steadily, without drama, the way a fire burns when it's been banked for the night. It is still warm. It simply asks less of you. The cottonwood on the hill behind the house was where she had buried him. She could see it from the kitchen window, and she did not avoid looking at it. Noah went to it sometimes and stood without speaking. Lily had once brought a handful of dried wildflowers and left them at the base. Neither child had been told to do any of these things. They simply knew. Clara had kept going because they needed her to. She had risen before them every morning, lit the stove, measured the flour, assessed the day's work, and done it. She had not done it gracefully every day. Some days she had been short with Noah and known it. Some days Lily had found her at the table after supper with her hands folded and her eyes somewhere past the wall, and Clara had come back from wherever she was and smiled and said, "Come here," and the little girl had climbed into her lap without asking what was wrong. She was not fragile. She had never been fragile. But the law did not concern itself with the strength of women who quietly held things together. The law concerned itself with names. And so the morning after Edwin's performance on Main Street, when Samuel Reed's water wagon rolled up to the fence line and stopped, Clara kept working the fence post she was setting and waited to see what kind of thing this was going to be. Samuel climbed down. He walked the fence line slowly, the way a man does when he's looking at something with his hands already thinking. He checked 3 posts without comment. Then he looked at the house, at the barn, at the 2 small faces behind the kitchen curtain. "If there was a husband's name on your deed," he said, "would Edwin Pike still have ground to stand on?" Clara drove the post mallet once hard. Let the sound finish. "Depending on the husband," she said. Samuel looked at her then. Not a long look, just enough. "I knew Matthew. I know what he'd want for this place." "Matthew's gone." "Yes." He paused. "But the land isn't." She put the mallet down. She looked at him the way she had taught herself to look at things that required careful reckoning, straight, and without hurry. "You'd be taking a risk," she said. "Town will talk. Town's already talking. They'll say I was desperate. Let them. The land office only reads paper." She was quiet a moment. A hawk crossed the far ridge, turned, vanished. "Come for supper," she said finally. "We'll talk about terms." She picked up the mallet and went back to the fence. Samuel touched his hat brim, walked back to the wagon, and drove on to finish his route. He came that evening as invited. He wiped his boots at the door without being asked. He sat where Clara pointed and did not pull his chair close to the fire. The supper was salt pork and cornbread and dried apple preserves, and he ate it the way a man eats who is accustomed to providing for himself, without complaint, without particular comment, finishing what was in front of him. Noah sat across the table and watched Samuel the way a 9-year-old watches a man who may be a threat. Steady, unblinking, arms crossed on the table the way his father used to sit. Lily stayed behind the curtain at first, then crept to the corner of the room and watched from there, her rag doll pressed to her chest. After the plates were cleared, Samuel laid out what he understood. The land office wanted evidence of continuous residence and improvement. A marriage registration with a male head of household would answer Edwin's challenge that the claim was improperly held. It would not eliminate the challenge. Edwin would still fight, but it would change the ground they were fighting on. Clara had already thought through most of this. She listened anyway, because the way a man explained his reasoning told you more than the reasoning itself. Then she put her own terms on the table. The deed would not change her name, her children's names. Samuel's name added as spouse, nothing more. Noah and Lily would not be asked to call him anything they weren't ready to call him. If the land office ruled in her favor and the trouble passed, Samuel could leave without obligation. Samuel nodded to each condition. He said he would sleep in the barn. He said the land was hers and she should speak for it. He said one more thing before he picked up his hat. "I'm not here to take anything, Mrs. Bennett. I'm here to help you keep what's already yours." She believed him, not because she was trusting by nature, she wasn't, but because a man who wanted something from a situation generally spent more time talking about himself. Samuel had not mentioned himself at all. She showed him where the extra lantern was kept in the barn. He carried his blanket out into the dark without looking back, and the door shut behind him, and the cabin held the sound of 2 children pretending to be asleep, and a woman sitting at her table with a lamp and the tin box of documents open in front of her, taking inventory of everything she had and everything she still needed to protect. Outside, the cold pressed in from all sides. Inside, the fire held. Reverend Miles Carter performed the ceremony 4 days later in his front parlor with his wife as second witness, and no flowers and no guests. Clara wore her good dress, the dark wool one with the mended cuff. Samuel wore his town coat. The Reverend asked the necessary questions. Both answered clearly. The register was signed. It took 11 minutes. Word reached the feed store by afternoon. In town, the news arranged itself into the shape people needed it to take. Some shook their heads. A widow with 2 children marrying the waterman, not a month after her brother-in-law made his move. It was plain desperation. Others allowed as how Clara Bennett had always been a practical woman, and practical wasn't the same as desperate, but it rhymed. Martha Dale, who ran the mercantile and had watched Clara settle her accounts to the penny every single month since Matthew died, said nothing to anyone but wrote down the date in her ledger and kept it there. Edwin Pike said it was a transparent maneuver. He said he would take his challenge to the county land office regardless, and that a sham marriage wouldn't hold up against proper scrutiny. He said this to several people, carefully, in language that sounded like reason. Samuel drove his water routes the next week, as he always had. When he came through Mill Creek with Clara on 2 occasions, once for flour, once for the harness repair, he did not put his hand on her back or her elbow. He stood near enough that no one could edge between them. That was all. Clara spoke for herself. She always had. At the homestead, the days organized themselves around work the way frontier days do, early and late, with the daylight given entirely to the land. Samuel was up before first light. By the time the children stirred and Clara had the stove going, the livestock were fed and the water troughs checked. He would eat on the porch when there was a plate left there, and return the empty dish to the step when he was done. The second week, Clara started leaving coffee in the pot. The third week, Lily set a tin cup on the porch railing next to her mother's. Samuel noticed. He did not say anything. He poured his coffee and held the cup in both hands against the cold and watched the frost come off the field in the early light. He fixed the cabinet hinge that had been pulling loose since October. Clara found it one morning, tight and oiled, without a word about it. He rehung the barn door so it didn't scrape in the mud. He replaced 2 fence posts on the south line, the ones Clara had been meaning to get to, and when she came out to inspect the work, he was already coiling the wire and did not wait for thanks. Clara sharpened the kitchen knives one evening and left his whittling knife at the edge of the table. He found it, turned it in his hand, and set it in his coat pocket without a word. Noah watched all of this from careful distances. The boy had taken on a kind of vigilance since his father died, a 9-year-old's version of the thing Clara did with her documents, always accounting, always checking the edges of things for where they might give way. He did not trust easily, and he was not wrong not to. He had watched his mother stand in the street and be talked about like a problem to be solved, and he had stood beside her with his grocery list in his fist and not known what to do with the rage that was too large for his chest. He did not rage at Samuel. He watched him. One afternoon Samuel was cleaning Matthew's old saddle. It had been hanging in the barn since the funeral, too good to sell, too full of association to use, and it had begun to mildew in the damp. Samuel had it on the bench with the saddle soap and a rag, working the leather back to usefulness. Noah came in and stopped. "That's my father's," he said. Samuel put down the rag. He did not argue, did not explain, did not look away. "Yes," he said. Noah took a step forward. His jaw was set like a man's, even though his face was still a boy's. "Tell me how your father wanted it kept," Samuel said, "and I'll do it that way." Noah stood very still. He had expected anger or a lecture, the kind adults produced when children complicated the situation. He had not expected to be asked. After a moment he crossed the bench. He showed Samuel where his father had always started, at the skirt, working outward, never against the grain. He pointed to the ring where the brass had worn thin and said his father had been meaning to replace it. Samuel listened. He moved the rag the way he was shown. They worked the rest of the afternoon without speaking much, and when they were done the saddle hung back on its peg in better condition than it had been in 2 years. Noah went inside without comment. But the next morning he came to the barn while Samuel was checking the wagon wheels and stood nearby, and Samuel handed him the small wrench without asking if he wanted to help. And the boy took it. That was all. That was enough. Lily had already made up her mind about Samuel in the particular way 6-year-olds make up their minds, quietly, completely, with no committee consulted and no deliberation required. She watched him. She drew her conclusions. She began acting on them. It was Lily who first moved his cup from the porch to the table inside. She did it one evening between setting the plates and calling everyone to eat, as naturally as if she had always done it, as if the cup had always belonged there. Clara saw it and was quiet. Noah saw it and chewed his lip. Samuel came to the door, saw the table, and sat down in the chair that had been left for him. He did not make a thing of it. Neither did Clara. That was the right answer, and somehow they both knew it. Winter deepened. The days shortened. The cold moved from crisp to serious. In the barn, Samuel added a second blanket and a section of canvas to block the wind off the north wall, and he told no one this. Clara noticed the canvas when she went to check on the horses. She did not say anything either. There was a particular quality to the silence in that house those weeks. It was not the silence of emptiness. Clara had lived in that silence, knew its weight, knew how it pressed against the corners of the rooms where Matthew's voice used to live. This was different. This was the silence of people being careful around each other, careful not to assume, careful not to reach, careful with the small, fragile thing that was beginning to exist between them without any of them having named it or asked for it. One evening Clara was mending at the table after the children slept. Samuel had come inside to sharpen the axe blade on the whetstone near the fire. The temperature in the barn had dropped to the kind of cold where metal gets brittle and fingers go stupid. He sat on the far side of the hearth and worked the blade in long, steady strokes, and they did not talk for a long while. Then Clara said, without looking up from her sewing, "Matthew used to do that, sharpen things at night." Samuel kept the rhythm of the whetstone. Good habit, he said. He said it was the only work that didn't need to be finished. You could always sharpen a little more. She put down the sewing and looked at the fire. He was easy to be around, she said. That's what I miss, not always having someone, just having someone easy. Samuel set the axe on the hearth and looked at his hands. My wife was easy to talk to, he said. Clara looked at him. He had not mentioned a wife before. I didn't know you were married. Was. Some years back. Diphtheria came through while I was out on a long haul. I came home to a house I couldn't live in anymore. He was quiet for a moment. I sold the property, bought the wagon, started driving routes, easier to live out of a trunk. The fire snapped. A log shifted. That's a hard way to grieve, Clara said. It was the only way I could figure. He picked up the axe, looked at the blade. I got used to not having walls. Clara looked at him for a moment, and there was no pity in her eyes, which was the right thing. Some people die, she said, and they don't mean for you to bury yourself alongside them. Samuel didn't answer, but the words settled somewhere in him. She could tell by the way he went still. The way a person goes still when they've been handed something they need to think about before they can hold it. He finished sharpening the axe and went back out to the barn. But something in the house had shifted, the way a room shifts when a window is opened just enough to let the air move through. The paper from the land office arrived in a form Clara had half expected. Edwin Pike had filed a formal contest on the grounds that Clara was unable to maintain the homestead requirements without adequate labor and male oversight, and that the recent marriage was of questionable legitimacy given its timing relative to the challenge. The contest would be heard at the county land office in January. Clara read the document twice, folded it, put it in the tin box. Then she spread everything in the tin box across the kitchen table. She had most of what she needed. Records of every improvement, signed receipts for materials, her own log of work done each season, Matthew's earlier filings, the original claim documents, the cultivation certifications. But there were gaps. The lumber receipts from the coop expansion. She remembered Matthew getting that lumber from old Haskins up at Pine Fork, but she couldn't find the receipt. The wire purchase for the east fence, same story. Matthew had asked Edwin to carry a parcel of papers to the county office for him the winter, before he fell sick. Edwin had said he'd done it. Clara had never confirmed it because there had been no reason to doubt family. She sat with this knowledge for a long moment. Then she went to Martha Dale. Martha listened carefully, as she always did, her hands folded on the mercantile counter, her eyes on Clara's face. I remember Matthew sending papers with Edwin, she said. I saw them on the street, Matthew handing a package over. Early that winter, I remember thinking it was late in the season to be sending documents. Clara thanked her and walked home. That evening she told Samuel. He listened. He looked at the table a while. Then he said that old Haskins kept ledgers going back 15 years. Every sale recorded by hand, every customer, every date. If Matthew had bought that lumber, it was in Haskins's book. If Haskins would let them copy the entry, it would serve as secondary proof. Pine Fork's 12 miles in weather that's going to get worse, Clara said. Yes, Samuel said, we should go before it does. They went 2 days later, just the two of them. The children left with Reverend Carter's wife in town. The road was frozen solid in the low parts and thick with slush where the sun had touched the upper grades, and the wagon made slow work of it. Clara drove. Samuel sat beside her with the collar of his coat up and his hat brim low, reading the road ahead the way he had been reading roads for a decade. 3 hours out, the right rear wheel caught a rut, and the wagon lurched hard left. The wheel held, but the horse stumbled on the ice and went briefly sideways. And both of them were out of the seat and at the horse's head before the animal could panic. They steadied it together, hands on the bridle, speaking low, waiting for the horse to stop trembling. Then they looked at each other across the animal's neck. "All right," Samuel said. "Fine," Clara said. They got back in the wagon and drove on. An hour later, in the long valley before Pine Fork, The road dropped into a stretch where ice had thawed and refrozen into something closer to a trap than a road, and the wagon sank to its axle in slush, disguised as solid ground. They tried to drive out of it, and made things worse. They climbed down. They put their shoulders to the back of the wagon and pushed, and the mud sucked at their boots, and the cold had long since stopped being uncomfortable and started being simply present, like a fact of the landscape. They got the wagon out by degrees, the way most hard things get done, a little at a time, without quitting. Standing beside the freed wagon in the road, both of them breathing hard and neither one speaking, Clara noticed Samuel's hands on the wagon side. The knuckles, the old scar along the right thumb, the steadiness of them even now. "You've been driving alone a long time," she said. "Long enough. Does it get easier, the alone part?" He thought about this. "You get used to it." "That's not the same as easier." She nodded, looked down the road toward Pine Fork. "Matthew used to say the land doesn't care about your grief," she said. "It just needs tending." "He was right," Samuel said. "He usually was." She paused. "I think sometimes I tend the land so hard because it's easier than sitting still long enough to feel what I've lost." Samuel said nothing. He didn't fill the space with reassurance or argument. He just stood there in the cold present, letting what she'd said be true without trying to fix it. They drove on to Pine Fork. Haskins was 72 and suspicious of strangers and happy to talk once he understood what they needed. He had his ledger on the table before the explanation was finished. Matthew Bennett, November 1881, 200 board feet of pine, payment in full, signed receipt. Haskins copied it out in a clerk's careful hand and pressed his thumb to the wax when Clara asked for a seal. On the drive home, it was getting dark and the temperature was dropping, and they had 50 miles of road behind them and 12 still ahead. Clara sat close enough to share the warmth of the wool blanket without either of them having to say anything about it. Stars came out hard and cold, and the horse knew the way back, as well as any road they'd traveled. "Thank you," Clara said once, simply. Samuel said, "It's your land. I just drove." She did not argue with that, but she did not believe it entirely either. The 3-day blizzard came in the second week of January, the kind that shows up without much preamble and proceeds to rearrange the world. The barn was 20 feet from the house, and the drifts between them were 4 feet deep by the end of the first day. Samuel could not safely manage the path. Clara told him to bring his blankets inside. He slept near the kitchen door, out of the way, not taking up more space than he had to. By the second morning, the children had stopped treating him like a guest. Noah came to him after breakfast with a snapped strap from his boot and held it out, and Samuel found the awl and the thread and repaired it at the table, showing Noah each step. Lily sat across from them with her doll, watching the awl go through the leather, completely absorbed. She asked questions in her small, direct way. "Why do you use wax on the thread? How do you know when it's tight enough? Where did you learn that?" Samuel answered each question the same way, directly, as if the question had been worth asking, which he clearly believed it was. That afternoon Samuel found the drawer of the kitchen chest that had been sticking for months. Clara had learned to work around it. The way you learn to work around 100 small, broken things when your hands are always full of larger ones. He fixed it without announcement, the smooth slide of it in its track the only notice anyone took. Clara opened it twice before she found words, and then she only said, "I've been meaning to do that." "I had time," Samuel said. The second evening of the storm, they ate at the table together for the first time without the children needing to be called in, without the meal being a ceremony of negotiation. Lily sat beside Samuel and asked if the doll could sit on the table. Samuel considered this and said he didn't see why not, so the doll sat between the salt and the cornbread with a kind of dignity that made Noah almost smile. After supper, while Clara washed the dishes and Samuel dried, Lily sat in her chair and looked at both of them, and then looked at the table and said, in the particular thoughtful voice she used for questions she had been holding for a while, After the land office says the land is ours, does that mean Chew Samuel has to go back to the barn? The dishcloth went still. The fire made its small sound. Noah looked at his plate. Clara looked at the wall above the window. Samuel set down the tin cup he was drying and looked at Lily with the same careful attention he gave to all her questions. "That's for your mama to decide," he said. Lily looked at Clara. Clara turned back to the dishes. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. The question settled on the table like a stone, dropped in still water, and the rings of it moved outward through the house for the rest of the evening, touching everything, quiet and undeniable. January brought the hearing at the county land office. They traveled to the county seat in the wagon, all four of them, the children bundled against the cold, the tin box of documents on the seat between Clara and Samuel. Edwin arrived with a lawyer from the valley, a man in a city coat who carried his papers in a leather case and spoke in the measured rhythm of someone who had learned that sounding reasonable was more useful than being right. The land office examiner was a man named Colton Avery, gray-haired, slow-moving, with the careful eyes of someone who had been reading documents and listening to arguments for 30 years and trusted neither more than the paper required. Edwin's lawyer went first. The contest alleged that Clara, as a widow without adequate labor resources, had failed to maintain sufficient cultivation and improvement of the claim. He noted the recent marriage as a reactive measure designed to circumvent the contest. He produced letters from two men in Mill Creek willing to attest to what they called the informal nature of the household arrangement. Avery read the letters and set them aside. Then Clara laid her documents on the table. She had organized them herself in order of date with a handwritten index. She walked through each one in the steady, unhurried voice she used when she was explaining something important to a child. Not condescending, just clear. The original filing, the cultivation records, the improvement certifications, her own log, season by season, the lumber receipt from Haskins, the wire purchase from the Morrow account, the receipts Martha Dale had been quietly keeping, Reverend Carter's attestation that he and his wife had observed the homestead in active operation throughout the period in question. Edwin's lawyer tried to interrupt twice. Avery raised one finger each time, and the lawyer sat back. When Clara finished, Avery looked at the documents for a long while. Then he looked at Samuel. "Mr. Reed," he said, "as the registered husband, do you have any claim to the property you wish to assert?" Samuel looked at the examiner without expression. "I claim the fence work I did on the south and north lines," he said, "and the cabinet hinge I replaced. The rest is Clara Bennett's claim and her children's. It was before I arrived, and that's how it should stay." The lawyer looked at Edwin. Edwin's jaw was tight. Avery wrote something in his notes. "And in your view," Avery said, "has the claimant maintained the residence and improvement requirements of the Homestead Act?" "I've worked homesteads for 10 years, Samuel said. "I've seen plenty that were well held and plenty that weren't. This one was being held better before I got there than most are with full hands." Edwin came out of his chair. "That's a statement of convenience from a man who married for reasons of—" "Sit down, Mr. Pike," Avery said. The room was quiet. "I've seen nothing in this record," Avery said without looking up from the papers, "to support the grounds of this contest. The claimant has produced documentation that meets the requirements of the Act. The marriage is registered and legal." He closed the folder. "My recommendation will be in writing by the end of the week." The lawyer leaned toward Edwin and said something in his ear. Edwin's face went through several arrangements before it settled on cold. Outside the land office, in the thin gray January light, Edwin managed to put himself between Samuel and the street. "You could walk away from this," Edwin said. "I'll give you enough to buy a new rig, a better one than you've got. She gets the trouble. You get clear of it." Samuel looked at him. "No," he said. "She's using you. You know that." "She asked me for help," Samuel said. "There's a difference." He stepped around Edwin and walked to where Clara and the children were waiting by the wagon. He helped Lily up first. Then Noah, who was old enough not to need help but accepted it without making a point of refusing. Then he offered his hand to Clara, and she took it, and climbed up and released it. And they drove back toward Mill Creek in the cold, clear afternoon, with the tin box between them and the children quiet in the back, and neither of them saying much. But neither of them was far from each other, either. 2 weeks later, the letter came. Martha Dale's boy brought it out from town because Martha had seen it at the post and knew it was from the county, and knew Clara would want it that day. Clara was at the table when she opened it. She read it once, then again. Contest dismissed, claim confirmed. Clara M. Bennett, claimant of record. Noah read it over her shoulder. His face moved through something complex before it arrived at a look his mother recognized. The face Matthew used to make when a hard thing had been survived. She reached up and squeezed his hand without turning around. Lily was watching Noah. When she saw him exhale and his shoulders drop, she exhaled too and put her doll down on the bench and went to stand next to her mother. Out the window, Samuel was at the south fence. Clara went to the door. "It's done," she said, loud enough to carry. "We keep the land." He straightened. He looked at her across the yard. He nodded once, then bent back to the fence post he had been driving. But she saw the set of his shoulders change. Not celebration. Something quieter and more lasting. The relaxing of a man who had been braced without knowing it, who could now put down a weight he hadn't named. Clara stood in the doorway a moment longer. The sky was the pale blue of deep winter almost finished. The cottonwood on the hill moved in the wind, its bare branches catching the light. She went back inside and made supper. Spring came the way it always does after a hard winter, not all at once, but in negotiations, a soft day, then a cold one, then 2 soft days together, and the mud beginning to release what it had held since October. The fields had that particular smell of earth remembering itself. And the children started spending the time after chores outside, which meant the house was quieter in the evenings, which meant Clara and Samuel sat together more often, without a reason arranged for them. He had been eating inside since the blizzard. No one had made a formal announcement about this. It had simply continued. The barn, light stopped being a nightly thing. One evening in March, the dishes cleared and the children put to bed, Clara sat down at the table with a cup of tea, and Samuel sat across from her, turning his tin cup in his hands the way he did when he was thinking through something he hadn't decided how to say. "The land office thing is settled." Clara said, "Yes. You did what you said you'd do, yes." She looked at her cup. "The arrangement was you could leave. When it was done." Samuel turned the cup once more, didn't answer. "I'm not asking you to," she said. "I want to say that plainly. I'm not asking you to go." She looked up. "But I also won't hold you to a paper that was written for a different reason than what this has become." Samuel was quiet a moment. "The fence on the south side needs another 2 posts before summer," he said. "That colt is going to be a problem if nobody works with her consistent. Noah still hasn't got the hang of shoeing cold iron." He paused. "Lily leaves the coop door open every 3rd morning when she's tired." Clara looked at him. "Those aren't obligations," he said. "They're things I want to stay and do." The fire made its small sound. Outside the window, the dark was soft the way it gets in early spring, not the hard dark of winter, but something that had given a little. "Then stay," Clara said. "Not for the land office. Not because Edwin might try again. Stay because I'm asking you to, as a husband. A real one." She pushed the bread dish toward him. It was something she'd done a dozen times without thinking, making sure he had enough. Samuel looked at the bread, and then at her hands still resting near the dish, and then at her face. "I'll stay," he said. He didn't reach for her, not yet. That was not the moment for that, and both of them knew it. What it was, instead, was something more lasting. 2 people, at a table, in a house they had both chosen, saying plainly what they wanted, and it being enough. Noah, who had not been asleep, said nothing from behind the curtain. Lily, who had been asleep, knew anyway when morning came. She set Samuel's cup in its usual place without looking up. and when he came in from feeding the horses, she handed him a biscuit the way you hand someone something that belongs to them. They were married properly in May, by which the whole town understood they meant married in fact, rather than arrangement. Reverend Carter said the words in the yard of the homestead under the new-leafed cottonwood, with the smell of turned earth coming off the garden and the children standing close. Lily wore a ribbon. Noah wore his father's watch chain, which Samuel had cleaned and repaired over the winter, saying it ought to be kept in use. There were no guests to speak of. Martha Dale came. That was enough. Samuel kissed Clara the way a man kisses when he is certain of himself and of her, not hurried, not performing. Brief and true. Clara's hand rested for a moment on his chest. Then she stepped back and looked at him, and looked at her children, and looked at the hill where the cottonwood stood over Matthew's grave. And she let all of it be true at once, the loss and the love and the living on. And she did not ask any of it to be different from what it was. The summer came full on. The garden came in. The colt was worked steady until her gait evened out. Noah learned to set a shoe properly, and did not stop until he could do it without thinking. Lily started remembering to close the coop door 9 mornings out of 10, which Samuel said was a marked improvement. In the evenings the wagon rolled in at the end of Samuel's route, and Lily heard it first, always, and was out the kitchen door before the dust settled. Noah waited on the porch. Clara stood in the doorway with the lamp already lit behind her and the table already set. And that was where Samuel's eye went when he brought the wagon through the gate, not first to the children, not first to the barn, but to that lit doorway, to the woman standing in it. He unhitched the horses. He came inside. The barn stood dark, no separate lamp burning, and on the hill under the cottonwood the grass grew green over ground that held what it held, and the wind moved through the branches. And the evening came down over the valley of Mill Creek, the way evenings do when the day's work has been good, and the people inside the house have earned the rest that is waiting for them. There are marriages that begin as paper arrangements because survival requires it. There is no shame in that. The shame would be in forgetting what you learned while you were surviving. Samuel Reed came to Clara Bennett's table holding nothing but his labor and his word, and he kept both. Clara held her land with her own hands and held the door open for a man who never once tried to walk through it uninvited. And the children watched all of it. The patience, the respect, the quiet dailiness of two people choosing each other in the small, specific ways that matter. And they grew up knowing what a real promise looked like. Not what it said on paper, what it looked like at the end of a day in the light of an open door. Thank you for watching. This channel is no longer supported by ads, and these stories continue because people believe they matter. Patreon is a quiet way to support the work with early access, story previews, and small moments of input before each tale is fully told. On screen now is a preview of the Patreon page. If you'd like to support the channel, the invitation is in the first pinned comment down below. I'll see you in the next story.